A director gave a homeless woman a job and a hidden camera revealed her shocking secret. It all started on a rainy morning when Mark, the director of a large company, was rushing to work. His day had just begun, but his mood was already ruined: traffic jams, urgent calls, and broken deals. On the sidewalk across from his office, he noticed an elderly woman snuggled under a dirty blanket. She was dressed in old, threadbare clothes and was holding a cardboard sign that read, "Need a job to survive." Mark had a flicker of an idea: take her to work as a cleaner. Why not give it a try? It's a pure experiment, he thought sarcastically. His co-workers would laugh, and he'd have fun. The following week, a woman showed up at the office. Her name was Lucia. She looked confused, but there was a hardness in her eyes. She went straight to work without question or distraction. When Lucia first entered the office, all eyes were on her. The company's employees, accustomed to strict suits and a professional atmosphere, could not hide their surprise and, in some cases, ridicule. Her shabby clothes and unsteady gait contrasted sharply with the glossy corridors of the office. But Lucia seemed to notice nothing. Mark approached her with contrived friendliness. "So, ready to get started? We need it clean so everything shines," he said, holding out a bucket of rags and a mop to her. Lucia nodded and quietly thanked him. Her voice was barely audible and her gestures were slightly slower, which was immediately noticeable. The employees sitting at their desks began to whisper. "What kind of circus is this?" whispered one of the managers, Tina, squinting at the new janitor. Her co-workers giggled as they watched Lucia carefully wipe down the conference room tables. However, it soon became apparent that Lucia was not as simple as she appeared. Her movements were surprisingly precise and organized. While the other cleaners left behind streaks and overlooked the little things, Lucia cleaned every corner with unprecedented care. There was an almost professional precision to her actions. By the middle of the day, the staff began to notice oddities. Lucia seemed to be able to understand their conversations, even though they were talking behind her back and almost in a whisper. She never turned around, but her face would subtly change, as if she realized what was being said about her. And when one of the employees accidentally dropped a glass of water, Lucia reacted instantly, jumping up faster than anyone expected. Mark, watching all this from his office, grinned. "Well, it looks like she's doing better than I thought. Let's see how long she lasts," he thought as he took another sip of coffee. The evening caught the office in silence. The staff had dispersed, leaving Lucia alone with her tasks. Mark, however, stayed behind. He had a habit of lingering in the office, reviewing documents and checking reports. His office on the second floor had glass walls that allowed him to see what was going on downstairs. And today his gaze involuntarily drifted to Lucia. She was working with incredible concentration. Her every movement was filled with a strange grace, as if she were performing a dance pas. Lucia lifted a bucket, wrung out a rag, moved the mop carefully, and it all looked as if she had been doing it all her life. But something about her actions made Mark wary. He remembered her first reaction that morning. Then he'd thought she was deaf, but now there was doubt. She was looking around, reacting accurately to sounds she obviously couldn't hear. Mark decided to check. He tapped lightly on the glass, waiting for her reaction. Lucia stopped, raised her head and looked directly in his direction. Her gaze was both intimidating and confident, as if she knew he was watching. Coincidence, he thought, but curiosity stirred inside. Meanwhile, Lucia continued her work. Her route around the office seemed to have been thought out to the last detail. She wasn't just cleaning, she seemed to be studying her surroundings. Sometimes she paused in front of desks, tilting her head slightly as if listening to invisible sounds. Her attention to detail went beyond the ordinary. Later that evening, Mark noticed Lucia stopping by one of the computers. The screen was on, but she didn't even touch the keyboard. She just stared at the monitor, and Mark thought her gaze became intense, almost threatening. He got up from his seat and went downstairs to see what was going on. "Is everything okay?" he asked, approaching Lucia. She flinched as if she had been caught in the act and nodded quickly. "Yeah, I'm fine," she replied without turning around. Her voice was a little louder than it had been in the morning, but it was still quiet and somehow strangely confident. Mark decided not to go any deeper. He returned to the study, but the feeling of unease never left him. Later, he looked at the day's video camera footage. And then he was struck by surprise. The cameras showed that Lucia wasn't just cleaning. She was stopping at tables, checking drawers, and while it looked innocent, Mark thought her behavior was too suspicious. "Gotta be careful," he decided. Tomorrow he would set up more cameras to see what was really going on. The next morning began as usual. Employees entered the office one by one, settled into their desks, and the hustle and bustle of a normal workday filled the space. Mark, despite his usually cool and collected nature, felt wary. Yesterday's observations were on his mind, and he couldn't get rid of his thoughts about the strange cleaning lady. Before starting the workday, he called the technician to his office. Together they reviewed all the video recordings from the previous day. Mark had decided to install additional cameras, hidden and aimed at the places where Lucia showed the most interest. The new surveillance system was set up so he could watch in real time through an app on his phone. "Make sure no one finds out about this," he told the technician. "Of course, Mr. Hansen," he replied briefly, realizing the seriousness of the request. When Lucia came to work, Mark watched her with redoubled attention. Today she seemed focused and absorbed in her work again. But one thing was immediately apparent: her route had changed. It was as if she could sense the changes taking place in the office. Lucia avoided the areas where the new cameras had been installed, which only increased Mark's suspicions. At one point, she stopped outside a conference room where employees were discussing an important project. She stood outside, pretending to wash the window, but her movements were slow and she was clearly listening. Mark saw this through his phone screen, and his patience was beginning to wear thin. He decided to check on her in person. As he approached the conference room, he pretended to be interested in how things were going. "How's the cleanup going? Everything okay?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Lucia turned to him with a smile, but there was no trace of embarrassment on her face. Her eyes lingered on Mark for a moment, and he felt a chill run down his spine. She seemed to be studying him. "Everything's fine, Mr. Hansen," she replied in her quiet voice. Mark walked away, but the inner voice in his head grew louder and louder: "She's hiding something." His suspicions were beginning to grow into paranoia. In the afternoon, Mark decided to conduct an unexpected experiment. He asked Tom's office manager to leave something valuable on the desk in his area, an antique watch that was usually kept in his safe. This was done under the pretext of testing the operation of the security system. Tom reluctantly agreed, but emphasized, "I hope this doesn't go beyond a prank. This watch is not only valuable to me financially. I assure you, everything will be under control," Mark assured him. He knew that the camera on Tom's desk would record Lucia's every move. And indeed, a couple hours later, the cleaning lady was there. She started to wipe Tom's desk, but stopped suddenly. Her eyes lingered on the clock, and Mark, watching this in real time, felt his heart begin to beat faster. Lucia didn't touch the watch. Instead, she stared at it for a long moment, and then it was as if she brushed invisible dust off its surface. She seemed to be struggling with herself. Then she went back to work without doing anything suspicious. However, her reaction only made Mark more anxious. He then decided to review the tapes since her arrival. Another observation struck him: Lucia not only avoided the new cameras, but also paid more attention to the areas of the office where documents related to financial reports were kept. She always stayed on the edge of suspicion without doing anything that could be used against her. After work, Mark stayed in the office late. All the employees had dispersed and silence hung in the building. He needed more information about Lucia to figure out what her secret was. Throughout the day he couldn't shake the feeling that she was looking for something, perhaps some specific documents or information. Mark downloaded all the archives from the cameras onto his laptop and began to study them. He noticed that Lucia often lingered at the financial analyst's desk and occasionally looked at the computer screen. It became clear to him that she was more than just a cleaning lady. Her interests were far beyond mopping floors and dusting. To finally clear things up, Mark decided to set a timer that would activate an additional hidden camera in the finance department's office. It was his last way to catch Lucia red-handed if she was really up to something illegal. Everything should be perfect, he muttered as he checked the settings. Around midnight, he decided to get some rest. However, his phone suddenly vibrated a notification from the security camera. Mark looked at the screen and froze. The footage showed someone moving around the office. His heart raced. The camera captured Lucia. Lucia entered the financial analyst's office holding a rag and bucket. At first she was actually wiping down the surfaces, but then her actions became more bizarre. She quickly pulled something out of her pocket that Mark couldn't see. Her movements became hurried and she was clearly agitated. She walked over to the analyst's computer, typed something on the keyboard, and pressed her ear to the monitor. Perhaps she was reading information off the screen. This didn't last more than a minute, after which she went back to cleaning as if nothing had happened. Mark felt anger begin to boil up inside him. He wanted to go to the office immediately and catch her in the act, but something stopped him. He realized that if he rushed in now, he would miss the opportunity to find out the whole truth. He decided to continue his surveillance to gather more evidence. His phone vibrated again. This time the camera captured Lucia entering the pantry. A minute later she emerged from there with a folder in her hands. Mark sensed this was a key moment. For the morning, he decided to secretly check the contents of that folder. When Mark arrived at the office in the morning, the first thing he did was to go to the storage room. He found the very folder that Lucia had taken. His hands trembled when he opened it. Inside were old documents dating back almost 20 years. They bore the name of a man Mark didn't know, but the last name was the same as his. There must be some kind of mistake, he thought. But as he delved deeper into the reading, his gaze froze on one paragraph. The documents contained information about a missing inheritance that had belonged to his father. Mark realized that Lucia obviously knew something about his family, and now she needed that information for some purpose. His suspicion was replaced by curiosity. Who is she really? At this point he decided that he would talk to her directly today. He needed to find out why she was here, and what really brought her into his company. Lucia was in the office early, as always. She was setting out cleaning supplies on her cart and seemed oblivious to her surroundings. Mark approached her, trying to look as calm as possible, although a hurricane of emotions was raging inside. "Lucia, can I talk to you for a minute?" he began, trying to keep his voice friendly but firm. The woman turned around and smiled, nodding. Her response was unexpectedly calm, which only added to the tension. They walked into a small empty office and Mark closed the door behind them. "I want to know the truth," he said, looking directly into her eyes. Lucia made no attempt at pretense. She lowered her eyes, folded her hands in her lap, and said quietly, "I thought you had already guessed." The phrase exploded into an explosion. Mark felt his whole body tense up. "What exactly was I supposed to realize?" he asked, trying to keep his composure. Lucia sighed and began her story. Her voice was steady, emotionless, as if she had been preparing for this conversation for years. "Years ago, your father ran the company you now own. But one day he fell victim to a major scam. People he trusted took everything, leaving him with nothing. Among them was the man who was my husband at the time," she said, looking at him questioningly. Mark felt his heart sink. The story sounded implausible, but he could hear the genuine pain in her voice. "I didn't know that my husband was involved in these shenanigans. But when it all came out, it was too late. He was arrested, and our son," Lucia hesitated, and her voice trembled. "Our son got sick. We had no money for treatment." Mark listened to her, feeling pity and distrust struggling in his heart. The story seemed too tragic to be true, but in her eyes he saw genuine tears. "And why did you come here?" he asked. "Why this spectacle with the cleaning lady?" Lucia wiped her eyes and looked at him. "I came to return what is rightfully yours," she said, handing him a small key. "This key to a safe deposit box in a bank. Inside are all the documents that prove your father's money was stolen. It took me a while to find them." Mark took the key, but his mind was full of doubts. He couldn't understand why she had suddenly decided to help him. "Why did you decide to do it now?" he finally asked. Lucia looked away. "Because my son is dead. And I don't want to carry the burden anymore." Mark left the office to think about what he had heard. He didn't know what to do with the key. He wanted to believe that Lucia was telling the truth, but part of him doubted it. However, his curiosity was stronger. He headed to the bank and opened the safe deposit box. Inside were indeed documents that confirmed Lucia's words. There was also a picture of his father and a little boy. On the back was the inscription, "Forgive us." Mark returned home in complete confusion. Everything he thought was true turned out to be just part of a more complex picture. Mark returned home late at night, still digesting what he had seen at the bank. He closed the door of his apartment, leaned back against it tiredly, and took a deep breath. It felt like the world had turned upside down. The documents from the safe deposit box confirmed that his father had indeed been the victim of fraud, but the real mystery remained: why had Lucia decided to reveal it now? He sat down at the table and spread out the papers, letters, and an old photograph in front of him. The looks on his father's face and the little boy's face in the photograph seemed to be telling him to trust. But trusting Lucia after all the strange events at the office was incredibly difficult. The questions were only getting bigger and the answers were still slipping away. The next day, Mark decided to do his own investigation. He called in his old friend John, a private investigator, to help him get to the bottom of the story. John, a man with a sharp mind and a cool head, listened carefully to Mark's story and studied the documents. "There's definitely something strange here," John said, putting the papers back in the folder. "This woman, Lucia, she's obviously hiding something, but she's also trying to help. We can start by doing a background check on her husband and son." Mark nodded. He couldn't wait. He needed to figure out who Lucia was and why she was connected to his family. A few days later, John came with news. He had found information on Lucia's husband, a former accountant for one of the companies associated with Mark's father. The man had indeed been involved in a major scam 20 years ago and had served time in prison. But their son's story turned out to be even more tragic. Her son, Michael, actually died of a rare disease a few years ago, John said, showing the death certificate. "And you know what the weirdest part is? He's buried in the same cemetery where your father is buried." This detail shocked Mark. He didn't know what to say. Was this a coincidence or part of an even more complicated story? He needed to talk to Lucia again. The next day, Mark decided to meet Lucia alone. He called her into his office, holding the photo and the key to the safe deposit box. "Lucia, I need to know the truth. Why did you do all this?" he began. The woman sighed, her face looking tired but determined. "I can't bring back the past, Mark. But I can help right the wrongs that have been done. You are a man who can bring justice. And I believe your father would want you to know the truth." Her words sounded sincere, and Mark felt the tension subside a little. But then Lucia said something that made him freeze. "Michael. Michael was your half-brother." The words came out like a thunderclap. Mark froze, unable to comprehend what he was hearing. Mark stared at Lucia, his heart racing. Her words echoed in his head, "Michael was your half-brother." He gripped the edge of the table, trying not to lose his balance. "What did you just say?" he barely audibly said, feeling his voice shake. Lucia took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage, and continued. "Your father, he was close to my sister. It happened long before your mother. Michael was the result of their brief but important affair. We only found out about it after my husband died when we found old letters." Lucia's words shattered his understanding of his own family. He wanted to scream, to accuse her of lying, but her eyes, full of pain and sincerity, told him she wasn't lying. "If it was true, why are you telling me now?" Mark asked, trying to gather his thoughts. Lucia closed her eyes as if she was having trouble remembering. "I've lived in fear for too long. My husband, he was part of the scam that destroyed your father. Michael always wanted to right his father's wrongs. Before he died, he asked me to find a way to tell you the truth." Her voice broke. "I thought I could handle it on my own, but only you can bring justice." Mark was silent. His mind tossed between anger, disbelief, and the bitter realization of the truth. Lucia continued. "I realize this all sounds unbelievable. But look at the documents, the letters. They'll confirm what I'm saying. Michael knew you were his brother, and he was proud of you, even if you never met." Mark took the envelope of letters that Lucia handed him. He opened the first letter, addressed to "My dear brother." The handwriting was childish, but the lines were full of tenderness and respect. Michael wrote how he dreamed of meeting Mark one day, but feared the truth would ruin everything. "This isn't just your legacy, Mark," Lucia said, her voice trembling. "This is a chance to restore your father's name and fulfill Michael's dream. Only you can uncover the truth." Mark returned home, holding the envelope with the letters and documents. For the first time in a long time, he felt not anger but a strange relief. The past had been complicated and painful, but it no longer seemed so dark. In the following weeks, he began working on restoring his father's name. Together with John, they exposed the scam that Lucia's husband had been involved in and cleared the family's reputation. Mark also turned the recovered documents over to the police so that the truth could be made public. Lucia left her job at the office, but their connection remained. Now she wasn't just an odd coworker to him. She was part of his family. The past never disappears, but sometimes it opens the door to a new future. For Mark, that future wasn't just about getting justice, it was about realizing that family could be so much more than he'd ever imagined.